I don't think I'll tell this story again. Not because I don't believe in ghosts, but because I'm afraid. Afraid that once I mention it, that ghost will remember that I saw it. Once I lived for a short time near a hospital. This hospital has a reputation for having high rates of infant mortality and unexplained missing babies. No one really knows why, but it's been happening since the French colonial times, when it was known as Beat Hospital. Now it's a teaching hospital for a medical college. It sounds normal, but the thing is, the Vietnamese don't call it a hospital. They call it a meat grinder. So yeah, maybe you can imagine how bad this place is. It's claimed many lives, and even worse, many families are destroyed here. Anyway, I lived in an old boarding house located deep at the end of an alley. Locals joke that this alley was Fetal Alley because it was located next to a row of clinics in a maternity hospital. The people who come and go are rarely men. Of course, some men do live here. There are several elderly people, mostly former employees of the hospital and their family members. However, there are also a lot of women. I think I don't need to explain what kind of women these are. You probably already understand. There are 7 rooms in the boarding house. The house is quite old, so the doors all have rusty locks, and most of them are locked. But this is common in Vietnam. We often cover our windows and doors with tarpaulin or cloth to keep out the rain, especially if it rains for a long time, and we are too lazy to wipe it off. This boarding house does the same, and there is one room no. 7, that is almost always empty. This room is not covered with tarpaulin. I once asked the landlord why, and he said that it was rented and then abandoned. Some people returned it before the week was up, he added. What's wrong? It's okay, isn't it? I asked. Is anything strange happening? Well, he hesitated. I heard there's noise at night, but who knows? I didn't believe him. I am a sober person, not superstitious. But things started to change one day in early July. It was the day Ms. Mai moved in. I still remember the first moment I saw her. She was carrying a suitcase and a thin cloth bag, but especially, she hugged tightly to her chest a light brown teddy bear. It was so old that one ear was torn. It's not that I'm a gossip, but after seeing I couldn't help but ask the neighbor about her. The neighbor said that she was a new patient at the hospital. Not much is known. The neighbor said, well, I saw her come in with 2 men. They said something to the landlord and then left. Maybe they were her husband and family member. As for why she was admitted to the hospital, no one knew. She didn't tell anyone. She just kept staring straight ahead. I watched my walk into her room and closed the door. The first few days, I didn't talk to anyone. She only went out at night, walking very slowly, always bowing her head, as if she was afraid someone would recognize her. She doesn't use a phone, doesn't make video calls, and doesn't have anyone visiting. She never turns on the lights. She only uses a small yellow bulb hanging on the window. The light is dim every night, making her room look like it's burning, a silent incense stick. One night, I woke up to a strange rustling sound, like crumpled newspaper, or someone lightly scratching a cloth pillow. I got up and looked through the crack in the window. May's room wasn't covered, and under that dim light, she was sitting with her back to me, placing a teddy bear on her knees and stroking her empty belly as if there was a living being inside. Good girl, she said softly. Don't be mad at Mommy anymore. Mommy is sorry. I heard her say, Mommy will give you back, she cried. Her voice sounded like she was crying. No, she wasn't crazy. I knew that feeling. It was the voice of guilt. After that night, I often woke up to similar sounds. Every night I secretly watched her through the cracks in the wall, watching her hold the teddy bear, caress her stomach, sometimes sing songs, and sometimes shout and scold. I heard her talking to someone inside her room. She said, we'll find a way out of this. Don't worry. Okay, I promise. Then she would cry. If I knew this would happen, I wouldn't have come to this world. I would have thrown myself into the river. I would have been happy to die than live like this. You would have been happy to be dead than live like this. Mai didn't speak Vietnamese. She spoke a language that I couldn't understand, but I knew these weren't native words. I thought she might be from a foreign country. Why did she come here? Why did she admit herself to the hospital What happened to her? Why did she have to apologize to her child? Why did she want to throw herself into the river? Time passed. After a month of renting the house, one night I heard heavy footsteps coming from room 7. I peeped through the crack in the wall. I saw a pair of legs. They were fat, short, ugly legs, like the legs of a frog. Then a hand appeared. It was large, dark, slimy, like the hand of a frog. Next was the face. It was pale, chubby, with wide nostrils, red lips, no eyelashes, and eyes that bulged like those of a frog. I screamed and hid behind the wall. That was the ugliest, most terrifying face I've ever seen. When I regained my senses, I quickly ran out of the house, trying to get away from there. That creature seemed to sense my gaze. It looked toward me and made a face like it was mocking me. I wanted to get out of the alley, but somehow I was paralyzed and couldn't move. The creature continued to stare at me, and I felt my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I tried to turn around and leave, but its eyes seemed to hypnotize me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was hoarse. Suddenly, it opened its mouth and said, "You can see me." Its voice was croaky like that of an amphibian. "You can see me, and you won't tell anyone, will you?" It approached me step by step, its ugly eyes fixed on me. "Will you keep it a secret for me? If you do, I'll let you touch me." Then it stopped moving. It stood still and stared at me. I tried to call out for help, but my voice wouldn't come out. I looked at it, then slowly reached out my hand and touched its cheek. It was cold and wet, like a frog. I then stroked its neck and it shuddered. I felt something hard and numb, like a bone. Looking closer, I realized it was a rib cage. Then I understood everything. That was a human skeleton. Luckily, it was just a nightmare, but it was so real, it scared me. From that day on, I started hearing the sound of a newborn baby crying every night. It sounded pitiful and desperate, as if begging for mercy. Sometimes I hear her singing to their child, "You go to sleep, my good child. You're going to be fine. Just sleep. You'll be fine soon." Now I am still haunted by nightmares. When I wake up, my entire body is soaked in sweat. At first, it was just a sobbing sound, like it was coming from the ground floor. I thought someone had turned on the TV or played a video to comfort the baby. But no, it wasn't the sound of the TV, because that crying sound repeated exactly every night, at the same time. 2:47 a.m. Not too early, not too late. I jumped up. At first, I was still rational. I thought, someone must have just given birth. "There are many pregnant women in this alley," I asked the landlady. She shook her head. "No one has a baby. It's all single people or young couples who haven't given birth yet. So, do you hear any crying every night?" "No, I don't hear anything, son." I found it strange. Later, I found out only I and the old lady at the end of the row heard it. One day, I stopped by the nearby cook to give her some apples and asked, "Have you ever heard a baby crying at night?" The old woman was cutting vegetables when she stopped. She didn't look at me, just mumbled, "It's been a long time since someone heard her. The baby, it can't walk yet." My hair stood on end. From that day on, the crying was no longer alone. It was accompanied by a giggle, but that was not a normal child's laugh. The laugh was like a child who couldn't speak yet, hadn't grown enough teeth. A short laugh, then a soft cough, as if choking. It didn't just laugh, it ran. I clearly heard the sound of tiny bare feet running across the hallway outside the room, then ceased. Then a soft screech on the tiled floor, like fingernails lightly scratching the floor. One night, I couldn't stand it anymore. I peeked and opened the door. I only saw a dim light from Mee's room, a shadow sitting right at the door, her back turned, her head tilted to one side as if listening. But what made me freeze? It wasn't Mai, it was her shadow, stretched out behind her, as if something was tightly gripping her back from inside the room. I slammed the door shut. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to ask Mai directly, "Sister, well, lately I've heard." "What?" "You've heard it right. You heard it right." "What?" "Don't ask me. I don't know anything. I don't want to hear anything. From that day on, I started to note the time the crying started and ended. It's always 2:47 a.m. start and 3:12 a.m. disappear. 25 minutes, regular, like a devil's schedule. Meanwhile, she seemed to be more tired than usual. Her face paler than usual. Sometimes even with dark circles under her eyes. Once when I came home, I found my slumped in a chair in the living room. As if she couldn't get up, I went over and asked cautiously, "Sister, are you okay? Do you need my help?" I slowly raised her head, revealing her pale face. Her eyes were empty, staring into the distance, but there was no focus in them. "Yes, I'm fine. Just thinking about something. Thinking about something. Yeah, just thinking about something," she murmured softly, then closed her eyes again. Her breathing, slow and shallow, seemed to fit the rhythm of the ticking clock. I wanted to say something else, but I didn't know what. How could I possibly talk to her about that sound? So I quietly left the room, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. In the dead of the night, while everyone was asleep, the darkness seemed to thicken, pressing down on me. That sound, the sound from Mi's room, became more frequent and intense. A piercing cry tore through the silence, followed by a maniacal giggle. A giggle of a child who hadn't learned to speak yet, hadn't grown enough teeth. A short, sharp giggle, then a cough, as if choking. The giggle disappeared. I could hear tiny footsteps running along the corridor outside the room. CCH, then CCH, then a soft screech on the tiled floor, like fingernails lightly scratching the floor. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed, walked over to the door, and listened. Each sound reverberated around me, growing louder and more terrifying. It was like a horror movie, but much scarier because it was happening in real life. Curiosity and fear kept me frozen to the spot for a long time. But after the footsteps died down and everything returned to silence, I finally moved again. I hesitantly opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. I could see Mi's slightly open room door from far away. I stood there for a moment, contemplating whether I should knock and go in. But then I remembered Mi's reaction. The last time I asked her about the crying, my heart raced. What if there was really something terrible hiding in there? But the curiosity was too strong. I took a deep breath, raised my hand and knocked on the door. But it was already too late. The door suddenly opened, revealing an empty room bathed in darkness. I stared in disbelief, trying to make out something in the gloom. Then I noticed a small, barely perceptible movement in the corner. Something seemed to shift. One felt a sudden chill. Was I imagining things? I called out tentatively. Are you in there?" Only Sans answered me. I hesitated for a moment, unsure what to do next. Then I decided to venture further into the room. As I stepped forward, my foot hit something hard. I bent down to pick it up and found a wooden comb. It looked ancient, intricately carved with strange symbols. An inexplicable feeling of dread washed over me. I quickly dropped the comb back down, but it was too late. A presence seemed to stir in the room, awakening from its slumber. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream split the darkness. I froze, paralyzed with fear. Ma screamed again, her voice filled with terror and despair. In a panic, I turned and fled. The next morning, after the horrifying events of the previous night, I avoided meeting Mi's gaze. I couldn't bring myself to ask her what happened. The incident in the middle of the night had shaken me to my core. Now the question echoed in my mind. What is she hiding in that room? Is there something terrible lurking there? Afraid to disturb the unsettling calm, I tried to focus on my work, but the quiet only fueled my anxiety. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside sent shivers down my spine. Mai continued to behave strangely. Her eyes were blank and distant, as if she were no longer there. I longed to reach out to her, to ask what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to break the fragile peace. Fear of what I might find or discover kept me imprisoned in my own thoughts. Days turned into weeks, and the mystery deepened. The crying and screaming continued each night, growing more intense and haunting. The laughter of that evil child echoed in my nightmares. I tried to distract myself with work, but it was in vain. Sleep offered no escape. Even during the day, shadows seemed to follow me, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. Then one day, driven by desperation, I decided to consult with an elderly neighbor, known for her wisdom and connection to the spiritual realm. She listened intently to my tale, her gaze distant as if peering into the very essence of my story. When I finished, she remained silent for a moment, lost in thought. Finally, she spoke in a low voice. "The crying you hear is the lament of a sacred fetus. A sacred fetus." My mind reeled. What did she mean? The old woman continued. "This spirit has been trapped here for many years. Its soul yearns for liberation, but it's tethered to this place by an unseen force. The entity feeds on negative emotions, preying on those who can sense its presence. It whispers to them, tormenting them until they break. But why is it drawn to why does it target her?" The old woman's eyes twinkled with understanding. "Mai is the vessel of the sacred fetus. She serves as its anchor, allowing it to linger in this world. She acts as its guardian, protecting it from the outside world." "But why? Why does Maya protect this entity?" The old woman shook her head sadly. "Some bonds are beyond our understanding. Perhaps Mai shares a connection with the entity that we cannot perceive. All I know is that if they are left alone, the entity will eventually claim Mi's soul." As I grappled with the cryptic words, the old woman continued, "To sever the connection, you must confront the entity, delve into the depths of its despair, and liberate its soul. Only then can you break the cycle of torment." "But how could I possibly fight an entity I couldn't even see?" Hope flickered in the old woman's eyes. "You may not be able to defeat it with your physical strength, but you possess an even more potent weapon, your purity. The entity thrives on negative emotions, but recoils in the face of innocence. Enter the room with a pure heart and cleanse it of the entity's darkness." With these words echoing in my mind, I hurried back to my room. My heart pounded. Was I truly capable of confronting this entity? Could my innocence be its undoing? Trembling with a mix of fear and determination, I made my way to Mi's room. I hesitated before knocking, then took a deep breath and let my hand fall against the door. "This is it. There's no turning back," I whispered. I took another deep breath, bracing myself for whatever lay behind the door. I knocked gently, hoping to catch my off guard. Who knows what I might encounter? Maybe a crazed look, a wild, manic smile, or maybe nothing at all. Whatever happens, I will face it. I will cleanse this room of its darkness and free both Mai and the sacred fetus from their torment. One night, Mai knocked on my door. She was trembling, pale, holding a worn-out teddy bear, her eyes wide open as if she had seen something terrible. She stood there hesitantly for a while, then finally mustered up enough courage to ask, "Can I come in?" I have no one else to tell. I let her in. She began to tell me a story I wished I had never heard. I was pregnant. My lover left me. I panicked. I came here. Room number 7. I aborted the baby there. The maid was an old woman, a midwife, no papers, no name. After that, I moved away. But 3 years later, the sound of a baby crying followed me. Every night I called, "Mummy, I'm cold." So I came back. I thought it was my child. I went to room 7, but the baby was gone. Then I heard her calling from inside the closet. She lowered her head, then said as if exhaling, "But I was wrong." She looked up at me with teary eyes and whispered, "It's not my child. It doesn't call me Mom. It calls someone else's name. It doesn't want to come back to you. It wants to be born from some corpse. It is looking for a body to return to." After that, I felt a chill down my spine and ran out of the house. I went to the old lady at the end of the neighborhood. She sat still for a long time and then said, "This boarding house used to be the home of a midwife who performed illegal abortions. Room 7 is where she works. Someone died during an abortion. There were fetuses left in the wall. Some didn't have time to cry. Each one a soul. But when no one remembered their names anymore, they merged together like old blood stains soaked deep into the tile floor. It couldn't be washed away. The thing that followed Mai wasn't her child. It's a collection of all the babies that were abandoned in that room. I didn't believe it until I saw it the last night. I woke up in the middle of the night, hearing crying right next to my ear. I turned around. No one. I turned on the light. The door was wide open. In front of me was standing in the middle of the hallway. She was wearing a white dress, her belly bulging like a pregnant woman. Her eyes were black, her mouth smiling all the way to her ears. It found a body to come back to. "It's you." Then she screamed, fell to the floor. Blood gushed out. Her stomach swelled up, then collapsed. No one had time to save her. She died, but her face was still smiling, the police concluded. Psychological shock led to suicide. No one mentioned the baby. No one asked about room number 7. As for me, every time I remember, I still see in my head the image of something black, tiny, crawling out of me's stomach, and crawling back into the crack under the tile floor. The boarding house is now closed, but every night I pass by, I still hear the sound of a baby crying and the whisper in the wind. I'm not your child. Please do not despise the creatures that have not yet cried, because if you do not give them life, they can drag you into death. After me's death, I moved away and was told by the old lady next door. She will never forget that night. At around 3 a.m., a scream echoed from Trang's house. It's still in my belly. The scream was so long it tore at my throat, then stopped. The door opened. The old midwife rushed out, her hands covered in blood, her face pale. She ran away. Neighbors rushed in. When I and a few others broke the door open, was lying in a pool of blood. Her body was cold. The fetus was half pulled out. The other half was still inside her. A scene that I never imagined would happen. After Trang died, no one dared to go near that house anymore. But I lived across the street. I heard and saw everything. Every night, there was a knock on the door, but no one was there. Then the sound of a baby crying. At first, it was soft, like rustling in the wall. Then it got louder, and it sounded like someone was being strangled and screaming, "You haven't given birth to me yet." I stayed awake many nights. One day, I saw the shadow of a woman sitting in the middle of Trang's room, her belly still bulging. She held her belly and kept rocking. Then, a baby's voice came from inside her belly. "I can't come out yet. Mom, you have to come out with me." After 49 days, no one cleaned Trang's house. The landowner hired people to demolish the house. They went to the bed where Trang died and found something horrifying. Under the old bed was a twisted shape, like the other half of a rotten fetus. But no one remembered taking it away. Only one man in the group of workers whispered, "I saw it, opening its eyes and looking at me. Its eyes were white." That person left the job from that day. No one saw him again. I moved out soon after. When I think back, I am haunted by that crying.